memoirs to be entitled A Trail of Stardust. So without further ado, please help me welcome David Schecter.
He's definitely taller than I am. Hello, hello. I wanted to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. People have traveled from as far away as Venezuela, Florida, and Francine's home state of Minnesota because they wanted to, especially Venezuela, because they wanted to celebrate the life of Francine, either because she was a friend or an artist they admired. I'd also like to thank everyone at the American Cinematheque, as everything has run so smoothly because of their expertise and experience. Despite the fact that Francine was proposed to more times than I'd worn a suit, she never got married and had no children, so her immediate family is rather small, all being related to her deceased sister, Deanne. Her relatives couldn't be here today because they had already committed to a baptism that they had planned before Francine passed away. However, they wanted everyone to know that they're here in spirit. I want to talk, I'm shorter than I thought I was. I want to talk about an incredibly talented woman I was so fortunate to know. Her name was Francine Jeric, but she didn't change her name to York because she was ashamed of her Slovenian-Serbian heritage. On the contrary, she embraced her ethnicity, which you'll experience at our dessert reception afterwards, where her beloved Slovenian dessert, potica, will be served. The problem was that people always mispronounced and misspelled Jeric, and that never happened when she changed her name to York. I own the Monstrous Movie Music soundtrack label, and I also represent some film composers. And Francine and I met at a Hollywood collector's show, since I sometimes sold CDs at events like that. During a slow spot that day, I was wandering around window shopping when at the table in front of me was a stunningly attractive blonde wearing a sexy, low-cut, bright red jumpsuit. But amazingly enough, I wasn't staring at her. Instead, I was focused on a movie poster beside her for the Doll Squad. I had never seen the film, had no idea what it was about, although I assumed it had something to do with a squad of dolls. But I recognized the movie's title because it was on the royalty statement of one of the composers that I represented, Nicholas Karras, who wrote the score. I walked up to this incredibly gorgeous woman, pointed to the poster and asked, "Were you in that film?" She looked at me straight in the eye and without batting one of her pretty eyelashes informed me, "My dear, I was the star." We looked at each other blankly for a second, and then we both burst into laughter. I mean, it wasn't like it was Macbeth or anything. And in my defense, the poster art looked nothing like her. She forgave me for my ignorance, gave me her email address, and asked me to contact her. I did, and we became immediate friends. We went to various events, hung out, and at one point she asked me to help her write her memoirs, but I was working on some other projects at the time. A few years later, things weren't going well with her book, and she asked me again. And for the next year and a half, we worked for about 1,500 hours through countless visits, 9,000 emails, Facebook messages, and my phone never stopped ringing. Her memoirs were incredibly important to her, as she felt a strong need to share some of her innermost secrets she'd been keeping from even her closest friends. I think it had been difficult for her to always put forth that public image that everything was perfect and she was on top of the world. She soldiered on, even while battling her illnesses. I went out to City of Hope many times, and we worked until she was too tired, and then we'd both take a break for a few days and resume our work. She and I were both convinced that if she regained her health, and if her book got some good press, with a little bit of luck, she might be able to resume the acting career that was so important to her. Although she'd been getting some work, the previous 10 years had been mostly sporadic due to her health, and also because she had been blacklisted when she was seriously injured on a studio set that resulted in a workers' comp case. Even though Francine was a female who was a little bit older than 39, and therefore she didn't even exist by Hollywood standards, she knew she had so much left to give her art if only she was given a chance. Her talent hadn't diminished, her memory was solid, and she had that incredible determination she displayed since she was a child. When Francine passed away, many people were stunned because up until the very end, she still had her looks, her optimism, and that zest for life that made you think she would keep going forever. Whenever something went wrong and she was presented with yet another obstacle, she'd say, "Onward and upward," convincing herself that she would ultimately persevere. I could never get Francine to read what we had worked on. Rather, she wanted me to read it to her, and she wouldn't tell me why for a very long time. She finally revealed that if she had read her own book, that would mean she was looking back on her life, and the only people who looked back were those who had nothing to look forward to. Francine was always looking toward the future, and appropriately, her book ends with one of her own quotes, "Tomorrow is a brand new day that hasn't been used yet." When we neared the end of our collaboration, I told her it was time for me to stop reading the book to her and for her to read it to herself. When she did, she absolutely loved it. She laughed at her naivete and all the scams and jams she had gotten herself into during her nonstop action-filled life. It's a very funny book because Francine had a wonderful sense of humor. I was supposed to pick up her handwritten notes to begin final edits on Saturday, January the 7th, but she passed away the day before I could pick them up. But I'm hoping I can make sure the book comes out exactly the way Francine wanted it because she felt this was a very important part of her legacy. Regarding the title of my little talk, The Yin and Yang of Francine York, she had played a Eurasian in a Surfside 6 episode where she discussed yin and yang with Troy Donahue's character. Francine had more yin and yang than anyone I ever met. Each one of us is something of a dichotomy with traits that are seemingly contrary to others we have, but they're all a part of our overall makeup. It's one of the things that makes humans so unpredictable. Francine York was probably more self-contradictory and unpredictable than just about anyone. This is not a criticism, but rather a statement of the complexity of her complexity, and it was one reason she had so much to offer to her profession and to her friends. For many, she was the red carpet Francine, the glamorous beauty who attended Hollywood events and hosted fancy parties, turning heads wherever she went, even at age 80. Always immaculately dressed, self-assured, even brashly confident, knowing how to appear as the star. In my opinion, that might have been one of Francine's greatest performances. She played that role so well and for so long. I think at times she might have actually believed that that was her, but it wasn't. Deep down, the real Francine could still be quite naive, sometimes very scared, and she had a very real vulnerability. I think that's one reason she felt an affinity with Marilyn Monroe, which is something you'll see in her tribute reel coming up. Although Francine might have spent most of her life in Tinseltown, her heart and soul still resided where she grew up, about 1,600 miles away, in the small iron mining town of Aurora on the Mesabi Iron Range in northeast Minnesota. Her paternal grandparents owned a farm that she sometimes worked on, with chickens and cows and rutabagas. Francine had a difficult childhood for a number of reasons. Her mother, Sophie, controlled their family's universe, including Francine's father, Frank, their home, and especially daughter, Francine. Sophie was beautiful and was fixated on appearance and neatness. From today's perspective, we probably call her OCD. Their various places of residence were like museums, albeit working-class museums. Sophie never left the house without looking immaculate, and she passed along this focus on appearance to Francine, who always looked similarly impeccable. Sophie was hypercritical, and nearly everything Francine did as a child was deemed wrong by her. Francine wasn't allowed to do any household chores or use the kitchen because she would be criticized relentlessly for making a mess or falling short of her mother's unreachable expectations. Sophie was Serbian, and Francine's father's family never accepted her into the Jerich family because they were Slovenian. This caused incredible stress for Francine's family, especially as they basically lived across the street from each other. Because of this conflict, Francine's mother and her paternal grandmother never even spoke to each other. In addition, Francine's father had a falling out with one of his own brothers, and they didn't communicate for 25 years. I always wondered if the reason Francine loved talking so much was because her family seemed to spend a lot of time not talking. Francine was the prettiest girl in school, the only one who wore makeup, and the only one who had braces since her mother needed a daughter with perfect teeth. Standing out among your peers at this impressionable age was very difficult for Francine. She was also the most talented person in school, and her female classmates were not only jealous of her looks, but also because she always got the lead in school plays. And the boys were convinced that someone as beautiful as she wouldn't want anything to do with them, so nobody in Aurora ever asked her out. And she had to date older boys who lived 20 miles away, which she did enjoy. She won a number of beauty contests, but often for her dramatic skills as much as anything else. And she won the Minnesota Declamation Contest when she acted out a dialogue scene between two elderly women, this being the first time in the competition's history that someone had tackled multiple roles in a single performance. She reprised the same roles for the Miss Minnesota and Miss San Francisco contests, doing very well in the former and winning the latter. Francine had a loving relationship with her father, but her critical mother pretty much restricted her positive comments to her daughter's physical, beauty, appearance, and talent. When Francine was only 3, and she and her mother were out watching the Aurora Borealis, Francine asked if it was the end of the world. Her mother responded, "No, it's a sign that you're going to become a star." The fact that Francine was born right across the street from the Aurora Borealis movie theater might have been more than mere coincidence too, as Francine felt she was fated to end up in Hollywood. To her parents' credit, they realized early on that Francine had talent, and they supported this, including her writing plays and working on the school paper. Francine's ultimate goal was to escape her small town and join the ranks of those who seemed to be living much more worldly and happy and exciting lives than she, the celebrities she read about in the movie magazines. By the time she was 14, she had ordered books to help her study the proper way to dress, wear her hair, and carry herself with class and distinction. Her goal was to be a model and an actress. She also learned how to eat right, stay fit, and be healthy. It's a good thing she was so talented, because she was inept at almost everything else she tried. From selling music lessons to secretarial work. After high school, Francine decided to become a stewardess. Not because she cared anything about that vocation, but because getting on a plane seemed like the easiest way of escaping Minnesota to pursue her goals. She failed miserably at working for the airline too, never coming close to becoming a stewardess until she played one 15 years later in Jerry Lewis's The Family Jewels. Eventually, she was hired as a sweater model, traveling across the country and learning and loving what life had to offer in the big cities. From there, she became a showgirl in San Francisco and Hollywood, which led to her acting career, but not because she was tall, pretty, and had a dazzling figure. It was because she had prepared for the moment, including studying with some of the best acting coaches in the business. She was driven, intelligent, had a superb sense of drama, and when she got the chance to perform, she was more than ready. Although she enjoyed playing the role of the beautiful, stylish, and outgoing actress, she grew up in Aurora as a nervous and insecure child. Her mother had controlled what Francine could and couldn't eat when she was young. So once Francine moved away from home, there was nobody to stop her from eating whenever and whatever she wanted. She ended up battling an addiction to sweets and junk food for much of her life. As a sweater model and actress who often depended upon her beauty and figure, the stress from this internal conflict took a toll on her and affected her health. It was also difficult for her to be a notable advocate of health foods and fitness, while at the same time realizing she was falling short of her own standards. It took Francine decades to finally overcome her eating disorder, and she hid this long battle from all but a precious few. Francine could dominate a conversation if she wanted to, and the topic would often be about herself, probably also due to her insecurities. But that's another one of her contradictions. Although she enjoyed talking about her talent and her career, probably hoping that might result in a future job or connection, she was also an extraordinary listener. Once you got a word in, she would never interrupt you, showing more patience than anyone I've ever spoken to. And she was actually listening to you. Sometimes we'd be conversing and I'd mention something in passing, and then maybe a month or two later, out of the blue, she'd bring up what I had said during that earlier conversation, wanting to know the status of things. I believe that's one reason she was such an extraordinary actress. I don't think she was just waiting for the other actors to deliver their lines so she could resume her part of the dialogue. I think she was listening in the moment to what was being said and then reacting properly. However, there was always one part of our phone talks that stood out. When the conversation was winding down, she had the most amazing ability to hang up and say goodbye at exactly the same moment. So you weren't sure if she had actually hung up. She'd be holding the phone saying, Francine, Francine, are you there? Well, she wasn't. She was probably at her desk messaging her many Facebook friends. Anyone who was close to Francine knew she had a super critical side. She could be devastating in her sudden statements of disapproval in someone. In my case, my teeth required whitening, I needed to stop wearing stretchy shirts, and she was 100% convinced that the reason I couldn't find a woman was because my $10 reading glasses were driving all the desirable ladies away. This past Christmas, she actually took photos of me wearing some of her own glasses, fully convinced I looked better in them than I did wearing my own. When I saw the pictures, I actually thought she was right. Francine's criticisms could seem incredibly harsh, like red-hot pokers, but knowing where they came from, they didn't bother me, because they were usually coming from a loving place. She had realized that her mother criticized her because she loved Francine and wanted only the best for her daughter. Similarly, Francine wouldn't insult you if she didn't care about you. But if she really liked you and thought you weren't living up to your expectation, to your potential, she would offer some suggestions because she really believed your life would be even better if you only took some of her advice. And I must admit, my stretchy shirts have not yet helped me land a good woman. Francine was a great self-promoter around friends, family, and on social media. But despite her appearing so classy and sophisticated on the outside, and despite her intelligence and knowledge in many fields like history and literature, she sometimes felt unsophisticated due to her rural upbringing. So she wasn't always able to sell herself and stand up to those in charge in Hollywood the way she wished she could. She knew she was a superb actress, but trying to convince the rest of the industry of that was a career-spanning battle. Her dramatic skills were often so subtle, her acting so natural, that people just weren't aware of how incredibly talented she was. Even with her glamour, she remained a small-town girl in many ways, including feeling close to her friends and family back in Minnesota. In 2001, she got a job doing a commercial for a new album by a recording artist called Di Lin. When she showed up on the set, everybody was really excited about working with this musician, but not Francine. She wasn't impressed, if only because she'd never heard of him. When he showed up, she could tell he was no amateur, as he handled himself well in front of the camera and was able to let the director know when he didn't like the way things were going. She enjoyed the job and even got her picture taken with Di Lin, but she still couldn't understand what the big deal was. It wasn't until sometime later that she was talking to her friend, Bill Mumy, best known as the wonderful child actor from Lost in Space and a musician in his own right. Bill couldn't believe that Francine had worked with this Robert Di Lin guy, who most of us know as Bob Dylan. When Francine eventually learned about this Mr. Dylan, she was a tad more impressed, but she didn't listen to much new music, preferring Frank Sinatra, Christmas songs, and old standards. She had no regrets that she hadn't talked to Dylan about his musical or cultural legacies or anything like that. But when she learned that he had grown up in Hibbing, Minnesota, about 40 miles from where she was raised, she was so disappointed she didn't know that when they worked together, as she would have loved talking to him about growing up on the Mesabi Iron Range. Francine had a strong Catholic upbringing, and her mother had always reminded her to be a good girl. But even so, Francine probably had more romances in Hollywood than half the people in this theater combined. However, she was aware that while sex and romance went together, sex and work did not. She turned down many opportunities for bigger important roles because she didn't want to sleep with the director, producer, casting people, network executives, or her agents. Francine loved falling in love and being in love, and she could fall in love at the drop of a handsome man's hat. However, she could also fall out of love rather quickly, and she had an awfully difficult time informing her boyfriends when they were no longer her boyfriends. So at various times throughout her life, she would have a few males who were all convinced they were the apple of her eye, whereas Francine had another apple in mind. This started back when she was a teenager, and her parents would sometimes have to escort one suitor out the back door of their house while the second one was ringing the front doorbell and the third one was calling on the phone. Francine told me about one time in Hollywood when she somehow managed to agree to celebrate New Year's Eve with two different men, one of whom was Hugh O'Brien. In her defense, Hugh had his own bevy of Hollywood beauties at the time. But after she realized she couldn't have two men kissing her at the same stroke of midnight, she phoned Hugh to tell him she had come down with a cold and reluctantly they had to cancel their date. So as she was driving to her other date, with her other date to a party, which was an A-lister at Aaron Spelling's house, they stopped at a red light on Sunset Boulevard. And I don't even need to finish the story now. Who should pull up alongside of them in the next lane? Hugh O'Brien, with his replacement date. He looked over at their car and saw Francine with her boyfriend. She said she felt simply awful, and it took Hugh years to forgive her, and even then, he barely did. When we were working on the book, she'd occasionally ask me if she had mentioned the 3-month relationship she had with so-and-so, either a celebrity, a royal figure, or a business tycoon. I had to tell her numerous times that we didn't have any room for more of her romances, as the book was already way too long. At one point, I jokingly suggested that we should drop all the romantic stories and instead have one page devoted to all the men she didn't have a relationship with. She thought that was hysterical. Unfortunately, she couldn't think of anyone. Of all her paramours, which included Ross Martin, Marty Ingalls, Bert Topper, David Gerber, Grace Kelly's brother Jack, John Philip Law, John Aniston, Clint Walker, Glenn Ford, Tom Selleck, and Vincent Sherman, the all too brief relationship she had with James Arness was the one that got away and the great lost love of her life. She connected with him so strongly because they both came from Minnesota and neither felt entirely at home in the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. However, whether any romance was ever going to be lifelong with Francine was always in doubt because she loved being an actress above almost anything else. Regarding her acting, she studied endlessly, created backstories for her characters when none existed, even for movies as dubious as Curse of the Swamp Creature. And she would sometimes suggest line changes, as she was an excellent writer too. She often wore her own clothes in her films and shows because the casting people liked what she had worn to her auditions. She talked to the hairdressers into doing her hair the way she thought was appropriate, and she was a perfectionist regarding all aspects of her performance. She had that attention to detail her mother did, but she definitely wasn't OCD. Her home was usually a complete mess, and we spent countless hours trying to find items she had held in her hand only 10 minutes earlier, but which had managed to vanish into the clutter. Once she moved away from living in her mother's museums, no doubt that was the end of neatness in her life. Francine only had one recurring series role during the second and last season of Slattery's People, and she really would have enjoyed the money from being in a hit series. But she was also happy that outside of her stage work and soap operas, she never had to repeat herself in a performance. Every time you see her in something, she's playing a very different character than the ones that came before. There was seldom any Francine persona visible on the screen. Helping to create these distinctions was her voice. Growing up in a mining town populated by immigrants from all over the world taught her an endless variety of accents and manners of speaking. Francine probably missed out on a number of opportunities because she rubbed some of her casting agents, directors, and producers the wrong way. She had grown up in a household without compromise, and there were times when she could be incredibly stubborn. She felt she knew how to portray her characters better than anyone else did. And the thing is, she was probably right. When you look over her body of work, there's nary a wrong move or approach. Other than a few low-budget pictures that had lousy scripts, she's near perfect almost every time. And now's your chance to see what I'm talking about.